A quarter of global trade passes through a channel less than 3 kilometers wide. 80,000 ships a year, carrying oil, gas, and goods, all through one strait. This was not random. It was a chain reaction of geography, empire, and one city's transformation. How did a tiny waterway gain this much control over Asia's economy? The real turning point is not where you would expect. By the end, you will understand why one disruption here shakes the global economy. The Strait of Malacca stretches nearly 900 kilometers between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, but the real story is about what happens at its narrowest point. Just off Singapore, the channel contracts to less than 3 kilometers, barely wider than a city park. Here, the coordinates read 1 degree 3 minutes north, 103 degrees 15 minutes east. Every day, merchant ships, oil tankers, and container giants funnel through a passage that, at its tightest, is only about 2.8 kilometers across. The natural width means little to captains. What matters is the engineered shipping lane, 2 parallel corridors, each just 600 meters wide, separated by a 500-meter buffer. That is about the length of 6 football fields, barely enough for 2 of the world's largest vessels to pass side by side. The International Maritime Organization's traffic separation scheme, enforced near Singapore, keeps the flow moving. Northbound vessels hug the Malaysian side, and southbound ships track close to Indonesia. In some stretches, the usable channel shrinks to 300 meters, hemmed in by shallow banks and scattered islands. Even the deepest spots, down to 25 meters, offer just enough clearance for the biggest oil carriers and container ships. The result is a high-density corridor, over 80,000 ships each year, tracked by automatic identification systems, creating a heat map of congestion that glows brightest at the bottleneck. On peak days, more than 1,600 vessels crowd the grid, inching through a space smaller than many city airports. A single mechanical failure, collision, or grounding here can halt the movement of millions of barrels of oil and tens of thousands of containers. All of this unfolds in a waterway so tight that a ship's captain can see the opposite shore with the naked eye. The scale of commerce moving through such a narrow gap is not just a quirk of geography. It is a standing challenge to global logistics, maritime safety, and the world's energy supply. The next question: why do so many ships risk this squeeze? And what happens if the flow stops? Every year, more than 80,000 ships squeeze through the Strait of Malacca. This is not just a busy highway. It is the main artery for nearly a quarter of all global trade. The numbers are staggering. About 25% of the world's traded goods, from electronics to grain to cars, move through this narrow corridor. That means 1 out of every 4 containers on the planet passes between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, bound for markets in China, Japan, Korea, and beyond. To put the scale in perspective, imagine a single container ship loaded with 13,000 20-foot equivalent units, enough to supply a city's worth of electronics or clothing. Now multiply that by hundreds of ships each week, each carrying a fortune in cargo. The combined annual cargo value sailing through the strait exceeds $5 trillion, according to United Nations trade estimates. Singapore's port, located at the strait's eastern entrance, handles around 35 million containers a year, making it one of the world's busiest transshipment hubs. This is not just about quantity. The strait's tight geometry means that even a brief disruption can ripple through global supply chains. If a single ship runs aground or a mechanical failure blocks a lane, the backlog can stretch for days, delaying deliveries across continents. For shipping companies, the Malacca route is not just the fastest option. It is the only route that keeps costs and emissions low enough to serve Asia's booming economies. The sheer density of traffic here is the reason why every major power, from China to the United States, keeps a close watch on this slender passage. The next question: who benefits from this river of trade? And how has control over this revenue stream shaped the region's history? Control of the Strait of Malacca has always meant control of the region's wealth. In the early 1400s, a Sumatran prince named Parameswara founded the Malacca Sultanate at the narrowest point of the strait. By forging ties with Ming China and adopting Islam, the sultans transformed Malacca from a fishing village into the busiest trading hub in Southeast Asia. Chinese porcelain, Indian cotton, Arab spices, and Malay tin all converged at the port. According to Portuguese chronicler Tom Pires, more than 1,000 ships could pass through Malacca in a single day. It was an early sign of the strait's commercial gravity. That prosperity attracted outside interest. In 1511, the Portuguese, led by Afonso de Albuquerque, attacked and seized Malacca. Their goal was to bypass Ottoman-controlled land routes and capture the spice trade at its source. Portuguese cannons shattered the city's defenses, and the victors imposed new taxes and licensing rules. Many Muslim and Chinese merchants fled, but the Portuguese plugged Malacca into their Atlantic and Indian Ocean network, shipping pepper and cloves to Lisbon and Goa. A century later, the Dutch East India Company ousted the Portuguese in 1641 after a protracted siege. The Dutch imposed a 10% duty on all cargo and banned private European traders, channeling profits to Batavia. Malacca's fortunes now rose and fell with Dutch priorities, but the city's status as a customs choke point endured. In 1824, the Anglo-Dutch Treaty handed Malacca to the British, who abolished the former restrictions and opened the strait to global shipping. Steamships and industrial raw materials replaced the old spice fleets. By the mid-1800s, British free port policies and new customs houses set the stage for Singapore's rise at the strait's eastern gate. Throughout these centuries, a clear pattern emerged. Whoever controlled the strait collected the revenue, dictated the rules, and shaped the region's destiny. That legacy of strategic competition still echoes in every ship that passes through today. After centuries of foreign control, Singapore's story took a sharp turn in 1965. Independence forced the city-state to reinvent itself, and the answer lay in its geography. At the eastern entrance of the Strait of Malacca, Singapore became more than a port. It transformed into a global nerve center for maritime trade. Today, it is the world's busiest transshipment hub, handling over 35 million containers annually. But raw numbers only scratch the surface. What sets Singapore apart is its layered ecosystem of services that keep ships and Asia's economy moving. Every vessel passing through can refuel at one of the globe's top bunkering ports. In 2023, Singapore supplied more than 50 million metric tons of marine fuel, dwarfing rivals in Rotterdam and Fujairah. Ship repairs and maintenance are handled in massive dry docks, where hundreds of vessels, from oil tankers to mega container ships, undergo around-the-clock overhauls. When breakdowns happen at the choke point, Singapore's proximity means minimal downtime and fast returns to service. Finance flows just as efficiently. Home to major shipping insurers and a maritime banking sector managing hundreds of billions in ship loans, Singapore acts as the financial engine behind the region's fleet. Even the paperwork is streamlined. Customs, cargo manifests, and regulatory clearances are processed digitally, shaving days off turnaround times. The result is a port that doesn't just move goods, it multiplies value at every step, drawing in global shipping lines and logistics giants. This web of services turns geographic advantage into economic power. The world's largest economies, China, Japan, and South Korea, now depend on the uninterrupted flow through Singapore's gates for both goods and energy. But as traffic surges and energy imports climb, a single point of failure grows more consequential. The next challenge is this: how vulnerable has this system become to disruption, and what are the stakes if the flow stops? Each day, oil tankers and liquefied natural gas carriers move through the Strait of Malacca carrying staggering volumes of energy. About 15 to 16 million barrels of crude oil pass through these narrow waters daily, close to a third of all global seaborne oil shipments. On top of that, around 150 million metric tons of liquefied natural gas flow through the corridor every year. For China, Japan, and South Korea, this is not just a convenience, it is a dependency. Over half of China's imported oil comes through Malacca. Japan and South Korea each rely on the strait for nearly half of their oil imports, and more than half of their liquefied natural gas arrives the same way. This concentration creates a single point of exposure. Chinese officials call it the Malacca Dilemma, a term that sums up the risk of having so much energy channeled through a single, vulnerable passage. If Malacca were blocked, Asia's fuel supply would face immediate and severe disruption. The numbers make the vulnerability impossible to ignore. Detours around the Strait of Malacca come with steep penalties. Ships rerouted through the Lombok or Sunda Straits add about 600 kilometers in 2 to 3 days to each voyage, increasing both fuel costs and emissions. Overland pipelines, like the China-Myanmar corridor, handle only a fraction of the strait's daily traffic. The long-discussed Kra Canal in Thailand remains stalled by cost and politics, and even if built, would serve only medium-sized vessels. That leaves the vast majority of global trade still funneled through Malacca's narrow lanes. Security once seemed just as daunting. At Piracy's peak in 2000, attacks reached 220 in a single year. But since the launch of coordinated patrols by Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, incidents have dropped to single digits. Even so, naval planners still treat the strait as a critical vulnerability. Any disruption here, whether from accident, sabotage, or conflict, would expose just how few real alternatives exist for Asia's supply chains. Today, one narrow corridor still anchors Asia's economic security. As energy demand surges and rivalries sharpen, every ship through these waters tests the region's balance. The world's supply chains remain hostage to geography, and every nation knows just how quickly a choke point can become a fault line.